The notary hadn't finished reading the documents when he jumped up. The chair slid back with a crash, hitting the wall. Andre pointed his finger at her wrist and yelled so loudly that the receptionist probably flinched. "Give me the bracelets and watch. They were gifts from my mother. You have no right to wear them." Valentina looked at the gold chain wrapped around her wrist. 7 years ago, her mother-in-law had given her the bracelet for their wedding anniversary. Not a gift, but a handover, like they hand out work clothes at a warehouse. "Wear it," Nina Grigorievna had said then, "or people will think we're not feeding you." The watch came later, a decade later. Not a gift either, an investment in the family's display case. She slowly unfastened the clasp. Her fingers didn't tremble. Over 15 years, she'd learned to control her hands when everything inside her was clenching into a ball of ice. The bracelet landed on the polished surface of the table with a soft thud. Then came the watch. The notary, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, watched over her glasses but said nothing. Nina Grigorievna sat to her son's right, as straight as a knitting needle. She wore a black jacket, a strand of pearls, and a hairdo she got every week at the same salon. To Andre's left sat Christina, the 23-year-old saleswoman he'd hired 8 months ago. His mother-in-law turned to the girl and said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think ivory would suit you better than white. White makes you look pale." Christina nodded, examining her French manicured nails. Her gaze kept drifting to the bracelet on the table. Valentina sat across from them alone. The coat she'd been wearing for 7 years was long out of style, but still held its shape. She'd altered the buttons twice herself and replaced the lining last winter. There was never enough money for a new one. Everything went to the family, as her mother-in-law said. To the family where Valentina had kept the books for 15 years, stood behind the counter, unloaded goods at night, and never received a salary. The notary cleared her throat and tried to continue reading the documents. According to Article 34 of the Family Code, she began, but Nina Grigorievna interrupted. "We know all that. Let's get to the point. The apartment is registered in my name, the store too. There's nothing to divide, really." She said this in the tone of someone explaining the obvious to a slow-witted child. Christina raised her hand and carefully, as if trying it on, brought her wrist to the bracelet lying on the table, not touching it, simply comparing it. Her lips curved slightly into a smile. Valentina noticed this movement and felt something inside her, long, dormant stir. She reached into her bag. The leather was worn, the corners frayed. She had bought this bag before her wedding with her first paycheck at the village store. Her fingers touched a folded sheet of paper, thick, official, with a blue seal in the corner. Nina Grigorievna chuckled contentedly, looking at the jewelry. Heirlooms, she said, turning to Christina. "Not for country bumpkins. My mother wore this bracelet, and my daughter-in-law will too." "A real daughter-in-law," she added, emphasizing the word as if the previous 15 years were a draft that could finally be thrown away. Valentina handed the paper to the notary. She accepted it, unfolded it, and put on her glasses. There was silence in the office for a few seconds. Then the notary's eyebrows rose. She put the document aside, took off her glasses, and looked at Andre as if she were seeing him for the first time. "This is a tax audit report," she said. Her voice changed, becoming drier, more official. "Regarding the individual entrepreneur, Nina Grigorievna Sokolova." Andre turned pale. It happened instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving a gray mask. Nina Grigorievna gripped the armrest of the chair. Her knuckles turned white. 15 years, Valentina said. Her voice sounded even, almost indifferent. "For 15 years, I kept double-entry bookkeeping. You gave the orders, Nina Grigorievna, and I carried them out. Only I kept copies of every document with my sister in another city. 3 months ago, I found correspondence with Christina on my husband's phone and sent it all to the tax office anonymously." She paused, letting the words sink in. The amount of tax evasion was 4 million rubles. The fine would exceed the value of the store. Nina Grigoryevna jumped up. The chair toppled over, hitting the wall. She screamed, not with words, but with a kind of animal howl, a mixture of rage and horror. "Snake!" she spat out finally. "The snake we've cherished." She lunged at Valentina and swung. The notary pressed a button under the table. A few seconds later, a security guard, a heavy-set man in uniform, appeared in the doorway. He stepped forward, grabbing his mother-in-law by the elbow. Nina Grigoryevna struggled, still screaming something about ingratitude and betrayal. Christina quietly rose, grabbed her purse, glanced quickly at the bracelet still lying on the desk, and slipped out of the office. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look at Andre, simply vanished like smoke. Andre grabbed the inspection report. His hands shook as he read the figures. Fine, penalties, possible criminal prosecution. He looked up at his mother, whom the security guard had pushed against the wall. For the first time in 15 years, Valentina saw fear in his gaze, not self-contempt, the pure, animal fear of a man who realized he had lost everything, the store, his inheritance. Years of enduring his mother's control for the sake of future well-being were turning to dust, to numbers on official paper with a blue seal. Andre's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen automatically. A message from Christina. "Sorry, I have urgent matters. I'll call later." He dialed her number. The number beeped, then remained silent. He dialed again. The subscriber was unavailable. Nina Grigoryevna slowly sank into the chair the guard had lifted and pulled toward her. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked old, not like the imperious mistress of a family business, but like a frightened old woman who had been robbed of the only thing that mattered. Valentina stood, straightened the hem of her old coat, glanced at the bracelet and watch still lying on the table, didn't touch them, turned and left the office, carefully closing the door behind her. A week after the divorce, Valentina opened the door to her rented room and saw the local police officer standing there, a young man with a red mustache and a folder under his arm. He looked at her without hostility, but also without sympathy. "Valentina Ivanovna Sokolova," he said, checking the paper. "There's a theft report against you. Come with us." The police station smelled of damp and cheap coffee. The investigator, a menacing man with tired eyes, placed the report in front of her. Valentina read and felt a chill rise from her stomach to her throat. Nina Grigoryevna was accusing her of stealing 300,000 rubles from a store register. Allegedly, the day before the divorce. Allegedly, there was a witness. The witness turned out to be Christina, the same Christina who had slipped out of the notary's office a week ago without saying goodbye. Now she claimed to have seen Valentina hide the money in her bag with her own eyes. The investigator looked at her, expecting an explanation. Valentina remained silent. She understood that this wasn't justice, it was revenge. Her mother-in-law had decided to destroy her before the tax authorities destroyed the store. She was allowed one phone call. Valentina dialed her sister Marina, the only person who kept copies of all the documents. For 15 years, she had been filing them in a folder. Every quarter, she took them to her sister in the neighboring town, insurance for a rainy day. A male voice answered the phone, unfamiliar and hoarse. "Marina's in the hospital," he said. "She had a stroke last night." The investigator released her on her own recognizance. Valentina took the first bus to the neighboring town. 3 hours of shaking along a bumpy road, 3 hours with only one thing spinning in her head. If only the folder was still there, if only Marina survived, if only she could make it in time. Her sister's apartment greeted her with an open door. Gennady, Marina's husband, was sitting in the kitchen with a bottle of vodka. He didn't look her in the eye. The room showed signs of a search. Open drawers, scattered things, an empty space on the shelf where the cardboard box with documents always stood. Valentina sank into a chair opposite Gennady. He spoke himself without waiting for questions. "A woman came," he said. "A respectable woman by taxi offered $100,000 for the folder. Marina is in intensive care. They need money for medicine for a nurse." He didn't know what was in those papers. He thought they were some old receipts. Valentina got up and left without a word. Outside, she vomited into the bushes by the entrance. She stood hunched over, her hands on her knees, thinking that her only weapon was now in the hands of the enemy. The originals were at the tax office. Yes, but without a copy, she couldn't prove she'd been keeping double-entry bookkeeping on her mother-in-law's orders. Without a copy, she was a common thief seeking revenge on her former family. She was detained the next day, 48 hours in a pre-trial detention cell. The cold, the smell of bleach, the snoring of her neighbor, an elderly woman caught shoplifting. Valentina lay on the hard cot, staring at the ceiling and remembering. 15 years ago, she'd arrived in this city with one suitcase. The village was dying. The school closed, then the first aid station, then the bus stopped running. Andre seemed like salvation, a city boy with a car and a family business. He spoke beautiful words and brought flowers. The mother-in-law put everything in its place on the very first day. "You'll be doing the cooking," she said, looking her daughter-in-law up and down. "I didn't raise my son to eat store-bought dumplings." In the morning, the lock clanked. The guard told her to get ready. Valentina thought he was going to be interrogated, but they brought her to the investigator's office, where an elderly man in an old-fashioned jacket was already sitting. Gray hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, attentive eyes behind glasses. "Pyotr Sergeyevich," he introduced himself, a former accountant who worked for the Sokolovs for 8 years until the owner fired him for daring to object. He learned about the case from the local newspaper. They published a short article about a tax audit of the store. He came himself because he, too, had something to tell. The investigator listened, making notes in his notebook. Pyotr Sergeyevich took a flash drive from his briefcase and explained. For the past 2 years, he'd been recording conversations with Nina Grigorievna, not out of revenge, but out of fear. He'd seen how she handled business and knew that sooner or later she'd need a scapegoat. He didn't want to be one. In the recordings, his mother-in-law's voice sounded just like it did in real life, authoritative, peremptory. She discussed tax evasion schemes, named amounts, and gave instructions. The investigator listened in silence, then turned off the recording and looked at Valentina. "The case isn't closed," he said. "It's simply suspended. They need an expert review of the recordings, they need additional testimony, but for now, she's free." Andre was waiting for her at the exit from the station. He was standing by the porch, leaning against the railing, sober, pale, with shadows under his eyes. The jacket was wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it, or not slept at all. "We need to talk," he said when she left. "Mother wants to negotiate. She's willing to withdraw her statement if you pick up yours from the tax office." Valentina paused on the bottom step, looking at the man she'd lived with for 15 years, at his haggard face, at the hands he didn't know what to do with. Once those hands had seemed reliable. Once she believed he would protect her from the whole world. She walked past him without a word. He called out to her, but she didn't turn around. Ahead lay a rented room, iced tea, and a sleepless night. But for the first time in a long time, Valentina felt not fear, but something akin to hope. Thin, fragile, but real. Like this video, so YouTube knows you're interested in video stories like this and recommends more high-quality stories. 2 million, said Nina Grigorievna, pouring tea into a porcelain cup. "The tax office is willing to settle if I pay the fine in installments, but I need you to retract your testimony. Say you miscalculated, that the documents are forged." Valentina sat in the chair across from her mother-in-law and didn't recognize the woman. In 2 weeks, Nina Grigorievna had aged 10 years. Her face had grown thinner. There were bags under her eyes. Her hands were shaking. The cup clinked against the saucer as she raised it to her lips. But her voice remained the same, steely, brooking no argument. The the voice of a housewife accustomed to being obeyed. The apartment had changed too. It used to be perfectly tidy, everything in its place. Now the desk was piled high with folders of documents. Unopened boxes of medicine stood in the corner. It smelled of valerian and something sour, like hospital supplies. 500,000, the mother-in-law continued. Cash and an apartment on an installment plan, a one-room apartment on the outskirts, but yours. Even an apology if that's what you need. She spoke the last words as if offering the greatest mercy, as if an apology for 15 years of humiliation were a commodity that could be bought and sold. Valentina was silent, looking at the woman who had called her a hick, who hadn't let her into the hospital when she lost her baby in the 3rd month. "No time to lie around," Nina Grigorievna had said then. "The store is taking stock." Valentina got out of her hospital bed 2 days later and went to count the invoices because there was nowhere else to go. Andrei appeared from the next room. He looked no better than his mother, haggard with red eyes. He led his ex-wife to the window, away from her mother, and spoke in a whisper, swallowing his words hastily. "They found a tumor," he said. "The doctors say stress accelerates its growth. If she goes to prison, she'll die there. Is that what you want?" He looked at Valentina as if she were the executioner, not the victim, as if it was she who had destroyed their family, not they themselves. Valentina remembered him standing in the notary's office next to Christina, how he remained silent when her mother called her a snake, how he never once in 15 years sided with her. She turned and left the apartment without a word. That evening, the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Valentina wanted to hang up, but something made her answer. Christina was crying on the other end. "They forced me," she said through sobs. "They said she'd fire me, that she'd cause problems. I'm from an orphanage. I have nowhere to go. I was scared. But now the store is closing anyway, and I want to tell the truth. Just protect me, please. I have no one." Valentina listened and thought about how easily the strong break the weak, how Nina Grigorievna used everyone around her, Christina, even her own son. How easy it is to intimidate a person who has nowhere to run. The next day, there was a knock on the door of the rented room. A man of about 40 in a gray coat stood on the threshold. He introduced himself as Dmitry Volkov, a tax inspector. Officially, he came to clarify the details of the testimony. Unofficially, to warn. "They're putting pressure on you," he said, looking around the cramped room. "I know how it works. First money, then threats, then worse. But if you change your testimony, you'll be charged with false accusation. The Sokolovs will find a way to get off scot-free, and you'll go to jail in their place." I've seen this more than once. He left his business card and left. Valentina sat on the bed for a long time, fiddling with a white rectangle of cardboard. It was getting dark outside. The streetlight flickered, flooding the room with yellow light. She was already falling asleep when she heard a ringing sound. Something slammed into the window, showering the floor with shards of glass. Valentina jumped up and pressed herself against the wall. Her heart was pounding so hard it was pounding her temples. A brick lay on the floor among the shards. A note was tied to it. "Shut up or you'll regret it." The letters were crooked, written in marker. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Valentina sank to the floor, right on the shard. A sharp pain in her knee brought her back to her senses. She took out her phone and dialed the only number that mattered now. Pyotr Sergeyevich arrived an hour later, bringing a thermos of hot tea and an old blanket. While Valentina sipped her tea, he silently boarded up the window with plywood he'd found near the trash bins in the yard. His movements were precise, confident, the hands of a man accustomed to doing everything himself. "I worked as an accountant for 30 years, he said, hammering in the last nail. "I've seen people like Sokolova break people with threats, money, connections. They think they can do anything, that the law is for the poor." He turned to Valentina, and she saw something akin to respect in his eyes. "But I've never seen anyone fight back. You're first. Don't stop." Valentina didn't sleep until morning. She sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the plywood covering the window. She thought that a month ago she would have surrendered, taken the money, retracted her testimony, and disappeared. But something had changed. Maybe the night in the cell. Maybe Pyotr Sergeyevich's recordings. Maybe Christina's call. She was no longer alone. In the morning, she went downstairs to get the mail. In the mailbox lay a white envelope with an official stamp, a court summons. Nina Grigoryevna had filed a lawsuit for the protection of her honor and dignity, demanding compensation, 1,000,000 rubles for slander and moral damages. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Valentina stood in the entryway holding the summons. 1,000,000 rubles. She didn't even have 1,000 for a lawyer. Her mother-in-law knew this. She knew, and she hit where it hurt most. But there was no fear. There was anger, cold, calm, like ice. Valentina folded the summons, put it in her pocket, and went to call Pyotr Sergeyevich. The war was just beginning. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. The courtroom was full. Nina Grigoryevna, wearing a black suit, sat in the front row. Next to her was a lawyer with a crocodile skin briefcase. Andrei sat a little further away, hunched over as if trying to become invisible. Valentina stood alone behind the defendant's podium, clutching the folder of documents Pyotr Sergeyevich had been gathering. The judge, a woman in her 50s with a streak of gray in her dark hair, opened the hearing and began reading the gist of the lawsuit: protection of honor and dignity, slander, moral damages, and 1,000,000 rubles in compensation. Her voice was monotonous, indifferent. For her, this was a routine occurrence, one of hundreds. The door swung open. People entered the room. First, Semyon the loader, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face. Behind him, Lyuba, the cashier, a petite woman with glasses, then Tamara the cleaner, then 2 more whom Valentina vaguely remembered, and last, Christina, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but with a straight back. The lawyer, the Sokolovs, turned around. His face twitched when he saw the procession. They sat in chairs, just like in the notary's office a month ago. Behind the former employees, a man Valentina didn't recognize entered. A nice coat, a neat haircut, attentive eyes. He sat down in the last row, took out a notepad and pen. The lawyer watched him go and whispered something to Nina Grigoryevna. She turned even paler. The judge raised an eyebrow but made no comment. She asked if the defendant had any witnesses. Valentina nodded. Pyotr Sergeyevich, sitting next to her, stood up and named names. Semyon was called first. He came to the stand, crumpled his cap in his hands, and spoke quietly but clearly. "They made me unload goods at night," he said, "without invoices, without documents. The landlady said, 'That's for our own people, none of your business.' I was afraid of losing my job. I have 3 children." Lyuba spoke longer. "Wages were paid in envelopes," she explained. "I signed the payroll for one amount but received half as much. When I asked why, the landlady said taxes eat up the rest, that everyone does it this way, that if I don't like it, the door is open." Tamara was curt. The landlady said, "Whoever makes a peep, I'll bury them." I believed her. She could. Nina Grigoryevna sat motionless, only the muscles in her jaw betraying the tension. The lawyer scribbled something in a notepad, preparing his objections. Then Christina stood up. She approached the stand slowly, as if each step was difficult. She looked at Nina Grigoryevna, who looked away, looked at Valentina, and something in her face changed, a determination that hadn't been there before. "They forced me to slander Valentina Ivanovna," she said. Her voice trembled but didn't break. The mistress threatened. She said she would destroy me if I didn't do as she ordered. I recorded our conversation. Then she took a phone out of her bag. The judge nodded, and the secretary connected it to the speakers. Nina Grigoryevna's voice filled the courtroom. "Tell her you saw her hide the money, or I'll destroy you, you orphan. You think anyone will look for you? You think anyone cares about someone like you?" Nina Grigoryevna jumped up. "It's a fake!" she screamed. "Editing! This woman is lying!" The court called for silence. The lawyer, grabbing his client by the arm, pulled her back into her seat and requested a recess. The judge denied the request. A man in an expensive coat stood up and introduced himself. Igor Vetrov, a reporter for a regional newspaper, explained that he was investigating a network of retail outlets caught evading taxes. The Sokolov family case, he said, was just one link in a much larger chain. He requested permission to attend the hearing as a member of the press. Nina Grigoryevna turned pale. Valentina saw her hands tremble, her tight grip on her purse resting in her lap. This was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a public meltdown. The very next morning, news of it would spread throughout the city. The judge called Andrei as a witness. He rose slowly, as if his legs refused to obey him. He approached the stand and glanced at his mother. She gave him a piercing gaze, a silent command. Then he glanced at his ex-wife, but immediately looked away. For a long time, he remained silent. The judge reminded him of the penalties for perjury. Andrei nodded and spoke. "Everything the previous witnesses said is the absolute truth. I was aware. I was involved. My mother orchestrated everything, but I wasn't blind." His voice was hollow, devoid of any emotion. "Valentina worked for us for 15 years without pay. We used her. I used her." "Shut up!" Nina Grigoryevna screamed. Andrei didn't even glance at her, continuing to speak. He told her about double-entry bookkeeping, about envelopes filled with cash, about fictitious invoices, about how his mother made all the decisions, and he simply obeyed her unquestioningly because it was easier that way, because the store belonged to her, the money was hers, and all the power was in her hands. The judge adjourned until the next day, the courtroom filled with a buzz. The journalist quickly wrote something down in his notebook. The former employees exchanged glances. Christina, burying her face in Lyuba's shoulder, was quietly crying. In the hallway, Nina Grigoryevna caught up with Valentina and grabbed her hand. Her fingers dug in like claws. The old woman's face twisted, her eyes blazing with madness. "You think you've won," she hissed. "I'll get you out from under the ground. You'll regret your birth." The guard pulled her away. A journalist filmed the scene on his phone. Tomorrow it would be on the front page. That evening, Valentina was sitting in her rented room when the phone rang. The investigator. His voice sounded tired and official. "I have bad news," he said. "Nina Grigoryevna Sokolova was hospitalized an hour ago with a heart attack. The hearing has been postponed indefinitely." He paused. "And also, she managed to transfer the store to her son. Technically, the tax claims are now against him, and he himself has nothing." Valentina hung up and glanced out the plywood-covered window. She thought about how her mother-in-law, even on the brink of death, continued to fight, that this woman would fight until her last breath. But one thing. Today, in the courtroom, Valentina saw the faces of the people who had come to support her. The very people Nina Grigoryevna had also used and intimidated. They were no longer afraid, and neither was she. 2 months later, Valentina stood in front of a display case of golden brown buns, inhaling the aroma of freshly baked goods, cinnamon, vanilla, warm dough. Above the door hung a simple sign, blue letters on a white background, Velena Baked Goods. This was her shop, the first in her life. 6 square meters rented from the city for a nominal fee, but every centimeter belonged solely to her. In those 2 months, everything changed. Nina Grigoryevna survived the heart attack, but the subsequent stroke paralyzed the right side of her body. Transferring the store's ownership to her son didn't help. The tax authorities proved the transaction was fictitious, and the claims returned to the original owner. The store was auctioned off to pay off the debts. The proceeds weren't enough to even cover half the fine. She had to sell her mother-in-law's apartment as well. Now Nina Grigorievna lived in a one-room apartment on the outskirts of the city. A nurse from the Sabez service came 3 times a week. The rest of the time, the former owner of the family business spent her time in a wheelchair by the window, watching the gray panel houses across the street. Valentina learned of this from Pyotr Sergeyevich and felt no emotion, no gloating, no pity. Only an emptiness where there had once been pain. Pyotr Sergeyevich became her guide to a new life. He introduced her to the wholesale suppliers he had worked with for 20 years. He explained how to keep honest books, how to pay taxes, and how to avoid repeating the Sokolovs' mistakes. Journalist Vetrov wrote an article about her story, 15 Years of Slavery in a Family Business. After the article was published, she received a call from a women's support fund offering her a microloan to start her own business. Valentina accepted. Christina worked there as a salesperson. She arrived at 6 in the morning, helped display baked goods, and smiled at customers. The girl from the orphanage had been given a second chance, and Valentina saw how she changed. She straightened her shoulders, looked people in the eye, and stopped flinching at sudden sounds. The bell above the door jingled. Valentina turned and froze. Andrei stood in the doorway. He had lost weight, looked haggard, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was wearing a work jacket stained with something dark. His hands were red and chapped, the hands of a man who carries heavy things in the cold. He had taken a job as a loader in a warehouse. Valentina knew that too. He didn't know how to do anything else. He stood in the threshold and said nothing. He looked at the display case with the buns, at the clean counter, at Christina in her neat apron, at his ex-wife, whom for 15 years he had considered an unpaid addition to the family business. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said finally. "I know I don't deserve it." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he had been silent for a long time. "I came to ask for a job, any job. I can't pay the rent. My mother won't let me in. She says I betrayed her in court." Valentina looked at the man she had lived with for 15 years. She remembered how he remained silent when her mother-in-law called her a country bumpkin, how he turned away when her mother raised her voice, how not once in all those years, had he sided with her. She remembered the notary's office, Christina standing to his left, the conversations about the wedding dress. She silently pointed to the door. Andrei nodded as if he had expected it, as if he knew it would happen, but he came anyway. He turned to leave. At the door, he bumped into a tall man carrying trays of baked goods. Mikhail, the widower from the neighboring house, who 3 weeks ago had offered to help with the delivery, just like that, as a neighborly thing. Then he stayed, and then began coming every day. Mikhail politely held the door open for Andrei. He walked out without looking back. Mikhail brought the trays in, placed them on the counter, and smiled at Valentina. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Now it is," she replied. Andrei saw this scene through the glass of the display case. He saw his ex-wife smiling at another man, easily, openly, in a way she had never smiled at him. He stood there for another minute, then wandered off down the street, hunched over in the light autumn rain. That evening, Valentina closed the stall and counted the takings, small but honest. Every ruble earned with her own hands was recorded in the book and taxed. No envelopes, no double-entry accounts, no late-night unloadings without invoices. She pulled an old photograph from her apron pocket. She'd carried it with her since the day she'd left the Sokolovs' apartment. It showed her on her wedding day, young and frightened, wearing a cheap dress that her mother-in-law would later call a disgrace. The eyes of a girl who believed a city boy with a family business was her salvation. Valentina looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the store window. That girl was gone. In her place stood a 42-year-old woman with wrinkles around her eyes and a strand of gray hair at her temple. A woman who'd been through hell and come out the other side, not broken, not embittered, simply different. She put the photograph back in her pocket. Maybe she'd throw it away someday, but not today. Mikhail was waiting for her outside with 2 cups of coffee. "I've been thinking," he said, handing her one. "Maybe we should expand our selection." "My brother makes excellent honey. We can sell it alongside our baked goods. People love something local and authentic." Valentina took her coffee and took a sip. Hot, bitter, with a hint of cinnamon. For the first time in 15 years, she thought about the future, and it didn't frighten her. It wasn't huge and overwhelming, like her debt to the Sokolov family. It was simple and understandable. Stalls with baked goods, the smell of vanilla in the morning. A man next to her, bringing her coffee simply because he wanted to see her smile. "Let's try it," she said. They walked down the evening street. The streetlights came on one by one, reflected in the wet asphalt. Somewhere on the outskirts of town, Nina Grigorievna sat by the window in her wheelchair and watched the sunset. In the warehouse, Andrei was unloading another truck, wiping sweat from his brow, and Valentina walked next to the man bringing her coffee and didn't look back.